Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry that I couldn't Skype through to you tonight as we'd arranged. I do apologise, but the time difference has made it a bit difficult because we're down in Melbourne with our son because he's won a competition and we're going out for dinner tonight. So I do apologise, but I hope I can answer your questions anyway. So our first question is from Terry. How long does it take me to research a historical novel like this? Especially as it often pertains to attitudes to women and non-white men? And that's a really interesting question. Um, it's kind of cumulative. I write about a book a year, and each book has specific research that needs to be done for that book. So in the case of The Desert Nurse, it was all about medical procedures in Cairo hospitals in 1915 to 1917. In The War Bride, I did a lot of research on divorce in Australia in that period, and that was quite surprising. There was a lot of bigamy, a lot of more divorce than we think of, really, as being in that period. So each book has specific bits of research, and then there's the kind of general stuff about the world and the time, which accumulates. The more you do in a particular period, the more you know about that period. But there's always probably 3 to 4 months of solid research before I start to write. And then while I'm writing, questions come up all the time. So you don't really finish the research until the book is published, frankly. And even then you might be doing some little extra bits to put on your website or whatever. So as about attitudes to women and non-white men, the newspapers are the great place to look, and in particular, letters to the editor. So all the things that Evelyn's father says to her about women doctors are taken from letters to the editor. So you can find out what contemporary attitudes were there, particularly the conservative contemporary attitudes, and also the progressive ones, because progressive people who were trying to make change also wrote to the editor. So I found those letters really helpful in terms of finding out the breadth of ideas and beliefs in the time. And so reading the newspapers of the time is something I do a lot of. The next question is from Becky. The inspiration behind her characters. I'm going to take my glasses off in between the questions because I can see that the light's reflecting from them. So the inspiration behind my characters is quite wide. If we take William, for example, his polio problem actually came from my family doctor, Dr. Kim Eung, who had polio as a young child in Hong Kong, and who has the same problems with his right leg that William has. And he's also the inspiration for the kind of doctor that William is. Very kind, very compassionate, very clever. The Evelyn, frankly, I don't know where Evelyn comes from. I knew that I needed somebody who was quite strong, who was determined, but also someone who had been pushed around a lot as a young woman and had had no recourse because of the laws of the time. She just sort of turned up one day. Sometimes you know where your characters come from and sometimes you don't. But I guess there were a lot of women. I read a lot of diaries of the nurses who went to Cairo. We're very lucky in Australia because Gallipoli was immediately recognised as being very important for Australia as a nation. People kept all of the memorabilia. So if they had someone who was in Egypt or who was in Gallipoli, they kept all their letters, they kept their diaries. And the Australian War Memorial has digitised all those and they're available to read. So I read a lot of the girls' diaries and letters back home. And I guess Evelyn is inspired by people like Alice King-Ross, whom you can read about on my website, and Connie Keyes. And both of those are characters in the book. But they were both very determined, intelligent, interesting women who happened to be at that hospital. who happened to be at that hospital at the time. So I guess as you research, the characters come forward. Major Bagley was a real person, and there are other, as I said, there are other real people who are in there, Lil Mackenzie, Connie Keys, and of course the wonderful Dr. Bennett, Agnes Bennett, who was a real person, first woman captain in the British Army, and the first woman in charge of a theatre of war. So she was put in charge of the hospitals in Serbia, in the Serbian theatre of war during the end of World War One. And so, you know, she's inspiring too. Back to the glasses for the next question. Oh, a question from Debbie. Oh, what inspired me to write a character like Evelyn who defied her father's morals? I don't know that they were morals, you know. Oh, you mean about the sex or about the job? There was a lot of sex going on in those days as well as now. War has a tendency to, you know, push people towards encounters that in peacetime they might avoid. So I think it wasn't so much Evelyn, the character, as the situation she found herself in as far as that was concerned. In terms of her being a doctor, well, women did do that. You know, there was a big shift in the last half of the 19th century and first half of the 20th century about the kinds of jobs that women wanted. And I think Evelyn was a privileged person. You know, she had education. Her father was a doctor, and she could see what that profession meant and was inspired by that, I think. So I guess I'm drawing on many of the stories of the women of the time, particularly the early doctors. And, you know, the early scientists and the early journalists, like in A Letter from Italy, is based on a real woman who was the first female war correspondent. And the more you read about these women, the more you realise that society wasn't monolithic. You know, we had this idea of what women were like back then, but there was as wide a range of ideas and attitudes then as there are now. And for the sake of the story, I chose the interesting part of that. Here we go. A question from Pam about books. Oh, that's really interesting. Any similar books or authors I would recommend? My grand's cousin was a World War II war bride from the UK to Canada. Right, I have a book for you. There's a wonderful book by Wendy Orr, that's O-R-R, called The House at Evelyn's Pond. And this is based on her own family history, and her grandmother was a war bride coming to Canada from the UK. And that book goes over 3 generations of women, and I think you'd really like it. It's a wonderful book. Kimberly Freeman is also somebody you might want to check out. She tends to write dual narratives, so one part of the story is in the present and one part of it's in the past. And of course, people like Judy Nunn. Lauren Chait is a new author also that you might find interesting. And Natasha Lester, also not quite the same kind of stories. Her people tend to be a little bit more glamorous than mine. They often have things to do like Helena Rubinstein, or they work for Dior or something like that. But I think you'll enjoy her writing anyway. So I think that was the last question that we had. Also from Pam. So thank you very much for your interest in my work. I'm more than happy to answer any other questions that you have. Just let me know. And next time round, let's hope we can organise the Skype to work so that you can ask the questions directly. Thanks very much. Bye.